Hi, my name is Leslie Briner, and I work on the issue of commercial sexual exploitation and trafficking of young people. I'm here today to talk about what is really a new name for a very, very old set of problems, and that is now referred to as human trafficking. Human trafficking is defined as the use of force, fraud, or coercion to compel somebody's work, service, or labor, or when someone under the age of 18 is caused to engage in a commercial sex act. A commercial sex act is defined as any time any young person is trading sex for survival, protection, money, drugs, or anything that gets them through the day. Under this definition, commercial sexual exploitation or trafficking does not require a third party, what we oftentimes refer to as a trafficker or a pimp. Somebody who is paying for sex with a minor is also guilty of human trafficking or commercial sexual exploitation of children. When people ask, who does this impact? You often hear things like, this can happen to anybody. And at some level, that might be true. But what the data suggests and what our experience working with young people suggests is that this is very, very disproportionately impacting young people who are already vulnerable, who are already system involved as a result of previous harm and abuse and systematic oppression and discrimination. So what you see is a very disproportionate rate of young people, youth of color, youth who identify as LGBTQ, youth who are experiencing poverty and homelessness, and youth who are involved in the child welfare system. And then there's what isn't represented in the data is things like the number of boys who are impacted by this. For a long time, the anti-trafficking movement has told the story that this is really about girls. This is about particularly pimp-involved girls. But when you look at the data on the ground and you look at who service providers are serving, what we know is that there is probably about as many boys involved in sexual exploitation and trafficking as there are girls, and there's a very disproportionate number of transgender youth, particularly transgender youth of color. People think about trafficking as this thing that happens over here to these people who are somehow different than myself. And the reality is that this is part of the fabric of our society. The sex trades in some form or another have been around for a very, very long time. And what we have to do in order to be more responsive and do a better job identifying young people is to have a really clear understanding of what this looks like on the ground and see ourselves as part of the solution for that. Trafficking and exploitation may be controlled by gang members or people affiliated with gangs. There is family-based exploitation that is either controlled by one member of a family, or sort of prostitution is the family business. Oftentimes, by the time young people end up with a third-party trafficker, they may have been exposed to some of this activity in their family. This is a part of this story that has been, I think, very underreported and misunderstood for a very long time. But many of the young people I have worked with, by the time they got to the doors of our program and had some sort of third-party trafficker, would say, well, I already know how to do this because this had been going on in my family in some way. There are also young people who identify as working what they call independently. These are young people that don't have any sort of third-party trafficker, but are in fact trafficked and exploited directly by buyers, either that they met online or in person. One of the big trends that has shifted in the last 10 years is that a lot of prostitution and trafficking was street-based, meaning it existed in a physical, street-based marketplace. Buyers had to go to that street-based place in order to access the people that they wanted to pay or trade sex for. But since the internet revolution and since the technology and accessibility of smartphones, a lot of that street-based exploitation has moved online. And it doesn't just live in one place online, it lives on commercial sex websites, dating websites, every single social media website that exists, and hobbyist sites, and review boards, and places into the dark web. And so when we think about this sort of street-based marketplace, we should understand that it's actually been replaced by mostly online facilitation and activities through social and peer networks. There's also what we refer to as survival sex, which is exchanging sex for basic needs, or how I think about it is exchanging sex for anything that gets you through the day. We know a lot of young people who are fleeing abuse and addiction and experiencing homelessness trade sex as an economic strategy because they have a very limited number of economic strategies available to them. The concrete red flags that we're more likely to see are young people who have relationships or people around them that seem to be controlling or coercing them in some way. Young people that have goods or services, technology, consistent access to drugs that they generally don't have a known means to pay for. Young people who have dramatic personality shifts and seem to know and be exposed to things because they have a new person or group of people in their life. And any young person who is experiencing chronic homelessness is at heightened risk for exploitation and trafficking. A lot of these red flags do need to be taken in context. Not every young person who is coming home with new articles of clothing or accessories or having access to services is necessarily being trafficked. Nothing in life is free. So if there is a consistent pattern where young people seem to have access to things that they don't otherwise have a means to pay for, it should be a red flag to ask additional questions, to try to develop a rapport with that young person, and see if we can understand a little bit better about what is going on in their lives. If you do identify a young person that you think is either at risk for or potentially involved in some sort of sexual exploitation or trafficking, what should you do? Well, the first thing is to consider the relationship that you have with that young person. One of the driving beliefs that we try to use around here is that relationship is the intervention. Young people who are involved in systems and traumatic situations like this don't easily trust people. And so rather than thinking that we can just go in and ask them a question and get a clear answer back, we have to be prepared to actually invest some time, build some trust, and ask direct questions that are caring and non-judgmental. You need to try to understand from their perspective that they're doing their best. We can ask open-ended questions like, do you need support? Is there anything I can do to help you? Do you want to talk? And if you want to ask directly about what's going on, you can ask a question like, sometimes people trade sex for money or things they need to survive. Is that going on around you? Or is that something you would want to check in about? If you want to do this, you will need to make sure that you're normalizing this behavior and not asking in ways that sound shaming or accusatory. Young people are much more likely to open up with us if they think that they're not going to be shamed and judged. Service providers and people responding to these situations should be really mindful of their own beliefs and biases, their own privileges and social identities. There are issues around race and social justice and gender and heterosexism that are deeply, deeply embedded in the commercial sex trade. And we need to be really mindful of how those show up in the work that we're doing with young people when we're either formal service providers or just community members who are trying to build a stronger community and support young people. How do we prevent sexual exploitation and trafficking? One of the things that we can all be thinking about is how we are building and contributing to a culture of consent. Consent that is an enthusiastic yes every time, that is specific, that is informed, and is freely given. The other thing that we need to understand in order to prevent future trafficking and exploitation and the underlying harm is that so much of the commercial sex trade is actually built on poverty and systemic inequality. And while it may be true that there are some adults out there that participate in the sex trades with full consent and choice, the reality is that many, many people, both adults and children, are there out of sheer necessity, that are there because they don't have other survival options, and if given the option to do something else, would absolutely go do something else. And so while we do want all voices to be heard and understood in this, we have to understand what we call the root causes. And those root causes are things like poverty, racism, sexism, heterosexism, and homophobia. And if we want to build a world where there is less sexual exploitation and trafficking, arresting our way out of this will not be sufficient. Focusing only on pimps and traffickers will not be sufficient. We must actually address the systemic inequality and poverty that is driving so much of the supply side, and we must understand why there is such a significant demand for commercial sex on the demand side. This is a very, very old cultural issue that has had different names and different contexts over the years. It is a social and cultural problem. It will not be solved by the criminal justice system. We can't arrest our way out of this. So we must build resilient communities, and we must be having much more open, honest conversations with young people about what is going on in their lives, what is going on their smartphones. Those are the skills that young people need. They've always needed them, but they definitely need them heading into the next generation. And we can all participate in preventing and addressing sexual exploitation by building those resilient communities. The experiences that young people have in the sex trades are very complicated, and there's a number of different impacts and ways that their lives change and shift as a result of this. But one of the really clear things that we see supporting these young people is how deeply shaming this is and how that impacts the way that they see themselves. There was a young person I worked with a number of years ago who was going to apply to an employment training program. And while she was out trying to find an outfit to wear to the interview the following day, she teared up when looking at herself in a mirror and said, "I just don't recognize myself. I never thought I'd ever get to go shopping for anything other than hoe clothes." The next morning when she got up, she was refusing to go, and she got very quiet, and she looked down, and her posture got really small, and she said, "They're going to find out. They're going to know. They're going to know who I am. They're going to know what I've done, and when they find out, no one's going to want me touching their food." And so this young person, after all of this time of work and, spending time with us and building a relationship with us, still thought so little about herself that she thought she was going to get found out and that people were going to find her disgusting. We think a lot about the sexual violence and the physical violence, but how do people understand? How do they build a sense of dignity? How do they increase their self-esteem so they can go back out in the world and make decisions for themselves? We can't expect young people to navigate this landscape without the dignity and self-worth to do so. And it's part of our job not just to support them with that, but to build a world that promotes that. Often when we're supporting young people, it's easy to focus on the awful things that have happened to them, the sexual, physical, emotional, psychological violence. But what we really need to focus on is how it impacted the young person, how it impacted their sense of self, their self-esteem, their sense of dignity and agency and safety and belonging, those core fundamental needs of all human beings. Our job is to support them in believing that there is a life for themselves outside of violence and exploitation and figuring out what the path and support that they're going to need is to get there. Whether your job is as a service provider or a member of the community or just a concerned individual, we all are responsible for building a world that is safe for each other and safe for the next generation. How you think about how you can contribute to this issue can be at a micro level, talking with people around you, or working on larger policy, legislation, or advocacy efforts that seek to interrupt trafficking and exploitation. But at the end of the day, I think what we all want is to live in and be part of a world that is free from violence and exploitation. If you want to make a report, you can contact Child Welfare, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, or the Polaris Project National Human Trafficking Hotline. If the young person would like to receive services and you're in the Seattle-King County area, you can call or email the Bridge Collaborative to receive additional support and advocacy services.